series of 3 community conversations sponsored by Headwaters that will focus on the challenges and the opportunities of funding quality education in Rappahannock County. Thank you for joining us this evening. Originally, we'd hoped to meet at the high school in person so we could have these conversations face to face. Unfortunately, the governor's order restricting the number of people who can meet indoors precluded that. And so we're doing our best tonight with an experiment. We're going to try a Zoom platform that should provide a way for us to have this conversation so we can all learn more about these issues, and so that we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and offer some comments. In just a couple of minutes, I'll introduce our 3 panelists for this evening. But first, I'd like to ask our own Brittany Dwyer, who is our administrator for these Zoom meetings, to take a couple of minutes to walk us through the mechanics. Brittany?
Thank you so much, Gary. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Gary said, I'm going to run through a few housekeeping things. I'm sure by this point, most of us have used Zoom many times, but just for those who may have not, I just wanted to let you know that I've muted all participants for the presentations. We want to allow our presenters to be able to converse and show their presentation without any mic feedback. And so if you see it popping up that I've muted you, please don't feel offended. I'm doing that for everyone this evening so we can get good audio quality. During the presentation, we are going to be allowing you all to ask questions through the chat feature on Zoom. So if you toggle to the bottom of your screen at Zoom, you'll see a chat box. Any questions that you direct into the chat box will come directly to me. I'll be managing all of the questions. And then after each presenter gives their presentation, we will open it up to the questions, and I'll be referring back to you for the questions. So I'll queue it up that way. Normally, if we were in person, we would have people, standing behind a mic. And it would be very clear to tell the order of people, but we're going to have to pivot a little bit since we're on Zoom. So we'll be using chat to do that. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in, and I will unmute you if you have a question for the presenter at the end of their presentation. And just as a reminder, this meeting will be recorded so that we can get this helpful information out to those who are not able to attend. All right, I'll throw it back to you, Gary.
Thank you, Brittany. And just to amplify a little bit on that last point, this will be a public document. It will be available to the public after tonight. So if any of you have any hesitation about joining live, probably shouldn't do that. Continue to be part of this evening, but just remember, anything you say tonight will be recorded and will become part of a public document. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists for tonight. I don't really know that any of these folks need an introduction, but I'm going to give you a short one anyway. Opening the conversation will be Dr. Shannon Grimsley, Superintendent and Cheerleader-in-Chief of Rappahannock Public Schools since 2017. With over 15 years of experience with Rappahannock County Public Schools, first as a teacher and then as an administrator, Dr. Grimsley has demonstrated remarkable talent for developing annual budgets that are extremely professional and highly transparent. Her presentation will be followed by Mr. Gary Curry, Rappahannock County Administrator since 2018. Mr. Curry came to us from Gloucester County, Virginia, where he held a number of jobs, including Director of Public Works and Deputy County Administrator. Responsible to the Board of Supervisors and to the citizens of Rappahannock County, Mr. Curry is in charge of the day-to-day operations of county government. And then closing the presentations this evening will be Mr. Wesley Mills, current chair of the Rappahannock County School Board. Mr. Mills is no stranger to the school board, having served at 2 different points, a lot of years. And as I said, he currently, I think this is his 2nd time, in fact, chairing the school board. His service as a representative from Jackson District is probably unparalleled in terms of school board participation. But more importantly, as far as I'm concerned tonight, we should note that he is the proud father of 4 graduates from Rappahannock High School and the proud grandfather of 4 currently enrolled students. So we are really, really glad. And on behalf of Headwaters, I want to thank these 3 folks for being willing to take their time and sharing their insights and their experience with us tonight. So starting off, Dr. Grimsley.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so honored to be part of such a talented panelist tonight. So thank you so much for the invitation to present to you all tonight, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, so we can walk through this presentation. Okay, can you see my slides?
It is working on coming up, and we can see it now.
Excellent. Okay. So, budget building blocks. Building a school budget is actually a great exercise and actually kind of a lot of fun. I know other superintendents and some of my colleagues look at me a little funny when I say that, but it just takes so many pieces of the puzzle, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of work by a lot of people behind the scenes. Always, we begin with our vision and mission at the schools. Our vision, of course, to empower every student to reach his or her full potential. And we want to promote a culture of learning, a roadmap for excellence, and the passion and character that leads to each student's success. In that, embedded in the mission and vision, we have our division goals that are in our comprehensive plan document. So we always use that as a starting point to be sure that our budget is really aligned to what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish. Otherwise, if you're spending money on things that you're not moving toward, it's a divergent path, and that doesn't help anybody. Our key considerations usually for budget planning are whatever increases that we have coming from the state, or what we feel like we need to do for competitive adjustments, since that makes up the most expensive part of the school budget. Enrollment and average daily membership, or your ADM. Retaining and recruiting talented staff, that is so critical. The only people that have a direct impact on student achievement are your teachers, who are directly with them in the classroom. So that is such a critical piece. Maintaining the integrity of effective programs, capital improvement needs, and whatever new state mandates come our way, which is ever changing every year. So this year, after analyzing a lot of data locally and within our buildings with our staff, we came up with these 4 priorities for our budget planning: amelioration of COVID impacts, teacher and staff raises, our high school academies, which is one of our, 2 right now. We have a health science academy and an agriculture academy, and both of those academies are sort of pillar programs for us and very innovative. And despite the pandemic, we went ahead and piloted those anyway this year. And thank goodness we did, because they're hugely successful, and we want to be sure things like this can continue. And then equity, making sure that we do have equitable access to all of our programs and are removing barriers to learning, especially as new additional barriers are coming to the forefront. For instance, like the lack of internet access among our families created a huge gap in access. We also want to know hear from the community and understand what the community feels are our priorities and what we should consider. So we did send out a survey. Of that, parents made up the most of the respondents. And this was the top 10 list from the community. And as you can see, it changed from last year's budget planning to this year, understandably. So for the community, teacher staff salaries, teacher staff benefits are at the forefront. And it was interesting that parents were the ones that responded to that and really felt that we needed to reward our teachers for everything they've been doing. Small class sizes. We really saw the benefit of having very small class sizes this year. And luckily, because we have been in person since August, and we've have had such small class sizes, we have been able to make great gains with those children when we have them. Now, there are other components too that play into what we're able to do and how much revenue we receive from the state. One of those is the local composite index, and you'll hear more about that later when our adept county administrator speaks about it. But this is the sort of funnel that our state revenue comes through, and that is determined by the true value of real property, adjusted gross income, taxable retail sales. And then there's a component for ADM that also is in that. So the calculus looks like this. Pretty simple formula, right? But as you can see from the formula, there's a lot in here that we don't have that much control over. And because the LCI is 0.7996, that means that almost 80% of our entire budget has to come from the locality. And then we only receive the rest from the state, federal, and other sources. So for our district, that's a huge ask and a big lift for our local community. So we rely on our community to support us as we're planning these things. So the community input is such a strong component of our budget planning. Now you have also these things called standards of quality, or SOQs. So the state tells you and mandates what you must have in every school district to keep your status as accredited schools. So your standards of quality, for instance, look like this. So kindergarten teachers, the state is going to, based on your ratios and numbers, say you need 2.21. Well, I can't hire a 0.21 FTE kindergarten teacher. I need 3 or 4. So as you can see, this is what the state will mandate and fund and base their funding on, but then also funnel that through your LCI. So you're getting a portion of what you actually need in just standards of quality. Staff compensation costs. At the beginning of our budget planning, it looked as though all points were pointing toward a 2% bonus or an equivalent action from the governor's proposal back in December. So that's where we initially began. It has morphed since the General Assembly conference budget came out to be a 5% increase effective July 1st, 2021. So as you can see the difference in cost there. So what we originally thought we were planning for, we had to scramble to try to figure out how we were going to make that cost work out in our budget at $446,000 to make a 5% increase work. And we are happy that this is going through because the teachers and school staff absolutely deserve it. What they were able to pull off this year was just remarkable. And I couldn't be more proud to be part of this Rappahannock family. They're amazing. Also about compensation too, we did, every year we analyze surrounding districts and benchmark to the median on our salary scales. And our teacher salary scale has been a difficult one, and it's been tough to catch up to surrounding districts. When they get a mandated increase in funding for that increase, other districts have a lower LCI, thereby getting more state funding. So they're more likely to be able to accomplish that without too much of an issue. With us, it is very difficult when the state tells you what you have to do and only funds this much. So what we did was analyze our staffing needs and our ratios, and we found that this, going forward, we did need to make a competitive adjustment, especially at the lower end of the scale between years 0 and 5, 5 and 10, and 10 and 15 of our teacher scale, because we will have a recruitment retention issue with more veteran teachers now nearing the ages of retirement and when the timing of their retirements and things. So we're going to need to attract new talent to the school system. So that's one way we have done it. So we have a new teacher scale with a compression between those years. And now it's much more competitive and more on par, I think, with the surrounding districts. Enrollment and average daily membership. So everybody reports out our average daily membership, and I think there's been confusion a lot about, well, 765, why is the enrollment so low? It's not exactly equivalent to enrollment. Average daily membership is actually the total aggregate daily membership of students in grades K to 12 who attend classes in school by the total number of days school was in session from the first day of the term to the last day in March. Okay, so it's a little different than how many actually have enrolled and how many students you actually are responsible for in your building. The ADM excludes preschool students, for instance. First step, our collaboration with CCLC, we don't count them. Disabled pupils ages 20 to 21 for whom we still have student records and we're responsible for education. Any students enrolled in the ISAEP or GED program, students in home-based education, private special ed, students funded with CSA funds through DSS, anything like that. So we're responsible for a lot more students than ADM captures. Okay, so that's a big differentiation there too. County contribution table, we have a $13.2 million budget. Out of that, this is how much the county contributes from local funds. And as you can see, our local contribution in 2021 was actually $474,000, 657 less than FY 2014. Now a lot has changed. ADM has come down, but costs have gone up too, cost of living and those things. So for us to be at that point, I think that's shown that we've done our work to really try to understand and be mindful that the tax burden of the school budget does fall on some of those that are most vulnerable, and a lot of our families and seniors with fixed incomes and things in our county. We understand the demographic and we understand the challenge. So we do work very hard to try to keep the costs as low as we can and absorb what we can. But we also have an obligation to provide the best possible services for these kids and our families. They deserve it. So with the county contribution so low, then how does the bottom line get so high, right? So we do receive some of the state and federal funds. We also work really, really hard to obtain any local grants that we're able to obtain from local organizations. Here are just a few of them that are going on right now in this school year. So that's why you'll see that bottom line of the budget kind of climb throughout the year, and a little bit different what you see at the beginning of the year compared to the end after we've had these appropriations for additional grants that we get. And also at one point in time, several years ago, we used to reconcile our actual federal and state funding later in the year, called the November appropriations process. And those of you who've been here for a while know what that was. And in working in collaboration with Mr. Curry and the treasurer, we have a much better and way to roll our books over, so we don't have that end of year spend out issue. They roll and you have a much better accurate picture of your budget up front. So that was another change that affected that. That was just a really quick run through of the pieces of building the budget, but there was a lot more that went into this budget. The school budget report, which is a narrative version that accompanies that 42-page book of spreadsheets and all those numbers, can be found on our RCPS homepage, or you can click on that picture, and I know Brittany Dwyer is going to add that to the chat for you, so you'll be able to download the document. And that was my presentation, so I'm happy to take any questions you might have. I'll unshare my screen now.
Thank you, Dr. Grimsley. And we actually did have a question in the chat from Mr. Michael Sands. So I am going to unmute Michael so that he can ask the question that he had. And Michael, I'm not sure if you're able to hear us, if you can unmute.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Shannon, you mentioned that where you have the 10th highest LCI in the state, what's the range across the state of LCIs?
The range typically, yes, great question. The range can go from, I think the lowest I saw was about 2.2, but it cannot go higher than 0.8. That's the highest. So at 0.7996, you see we're right at that level, and we have been at 0.8 before.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Grimsley. And another question that we had, so comments have been made from time to time that the school with programs like the new school-based wellness clinic or a deviation from the district's core mission. What are your thoughts on this?
Everything that we do, we try to embed it within our goals. And with regard to the wellness center itself, we find that barriers to wellness are barriers to achievement and barriers to learning. So for the last 5 years or so, we've had a heavy focus on health and wellness of our staff, of our students, and our community. It fits into the Commit to Be Fit program. So all of those are pieces that we feel that if we can help, we will, removing access barriers for our families, and especially with the end goal of helping our students succeed the best that they can. And that should be something that everybody can agree on, I would think. But the other thing is that the schools in Rappahannock County truly are the only community center we have. They don't have access to a lot of health and wellness centers or community centers or youth centers or anything really. So we do provide over 80% of services to our students and their families.
Thank you. And jumping back to the LCI, we had one more thing pop up in the chat. Are there main factors which drive up our LCI to make it so high?
Yes, those other pieces that are in that formula, the AGI or adjusted gross income and real estate property values, things like that, can drive it up. And also having a lower LCI, I mean, a lower ADM. So the smaller that denominator gets, that affects the formula quite a bit. And I know Mr. Curry is going to speak about that later, so I'll leave that part to him. But yes, there are pieces that do impact it, but pieces that we don't have a whole lot of control over. Again, so local composite index is a really difficult formula and calculation to try to influence.
Thank you. And that's actually a perfect segue into our next presenter, which is Mr. Gary Curry. So I am going to throw the mic over to him. And remember, if you all have questions throughout, you can put them in the chat and we will queue those up for after each presentation, as well as at the end, we'll have an open mic.
All right, thank you very much. Let me try to share my screen. Everybody see that okay?
We do.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Dr. Grimsley, and for leading things off, and for all of you for taking a little bit of time out of your evening to share it with us. I know it's there's probably a lot of other things you could be doing, and I appreciate that you're interested in our local government. For those of you who had the opportunity to hear my budget presentation, I've shared or borrowed a few things from that, and I've added a few new things. So hopefully we can all learn a little bit together. Also, I'm hopeful that these slides can be provided and shared by Headwaters at a later time. I packed a lot of information into them so they could be used as a takeaway. So don't feel like we need to drill in all the details here, but hopefully they're a resource for you later. Overall, the school budget is just a part of the overall county budget. And it has a pretty lengthy budget adoption process that starts in the fall, and the schools are deep in their work in developing their portion of the overall budget in the fall. The department and agency requests come to me in January. Outside agencies get to me in February. I wrap up final coordination with Dr. Grimsley and her team just before introducing a balanced budget. And this year that was on March 10th, and the Code of Virginia requires me in my role to provide a balanced budget to the board. The board then reviews that overall budget, it massages it, so to say, into their budget over time, and then shares it with the public for public hearing. So everybody that's listening tonight, you can be engaged on April 19th. Review the budget that the board has put it to your discretion, and let us know what's important. This budget that ultimately is adopted is, for lack of a better word, the strategic plan for Rappahannock County. Where the money goes, the priority goes, and this is the driving factor of what we will do in the next fiscal year from July 1 through June 30th. Once the board adopts the budget, sometimes that may adjust what the school board has available to them. It may be less than what they asked for. I suppose it could be more than what they asked for. So they need to go back and reconcile their budget after the board adopts that final budget by May 15th by code, at least the school part. So don't worry too much about all the numbers, but I want you to take away from this that, as I noted, there's not a school budget and a county budget. There is a county budget of which the school budget is part. And it's a very large part because of the size and the details, but it's one part. And you can see in the table on this slide, we have several independent funds that are all budgeted separately. All those funds have a source of revenue and then a defined expenditure, and those revenues match those expenditures for each of the funds. You can see I've highlighted in red the two school funds, the school fund and the school cafeteria fund. But I've also highlighted in green at the top right, the value of the general fund. And when you look at the funds in this particular way, they're overstated because the general fund, in fact, includes that transfer that Dr. Grimsley mentioned that ends up in school fund. So of the $13 million in the school fund, a part of which includes a transfer to the cafeteria fund, $8 million of that $19 million is heading to the school fund, and there's other dollars that are heading to other funds. So the best way to look at this is to look at it with the transfers removed to really get an understanding of the relative size of the different budgets. And when you do that, it provides a much better perspective of the relative size of the different funds. So this table is tracking from year to year, from FY20 to 21 to 22, the original proposed budget, originally adopted budget, and the proposed budget for FY22. You can see again the school funds are highlighted. You can see some growth over that period, and it's a very significant growth, but you also have to recognize that we've had some atypical funding years with federal stimulus coming in. You can see here in this case, the general fund in green is now shown as only $7 million. Well, the other slide, it was $19 million. And that's because of all those $19 million, all but $7.9 million is being transferred to other funds to support them. And those are transfers to the Social Services Fund, to the Children's Services Fund, to the Library Fund, Fire Service, et cetera. Those transfers are going to other funds from the general fund. Looking at a table like this, it really doesn't give you a good picture of those relative values. And so we break out some graphics to help us understand that relative proportion. And this is the same graphic that I included in my budget presentation. And you can see the school fund is 48.4% of the entire budget from a perspective of dollars spent. So this is without those transfers involved. But then you look on the top of the breakout stack chart, you have the school cafeteria fund, which is another 1.6%. And if you add those together, it's 49.9% of the entire budget that's being spent is attributable to the schools. And that has a lot to do with what Dr. Grimsley was mentioning with the LCI and the fact that we do pay a large share of our expenses for schools here locally. And if it were a little bit different, you might see that change. You can see the general fund. Those are your court costs, building inspections costs, things like that you would think of local government. Social services and children's services, another big piece of our budget. Capital, and then our fire service fund, which funds our volunteer fire departments. So overall, now looking back at all those funds and those expenditures, we can ask ourselves, well, what percentage of those funds in those cost areas is funded locally versus non-locally? And by non-locally, I mean by state or federal funds, or grants, as the case may be for the schools. So I've highlighted the schools in this chart, and you can see as it runs from left to right, the more blue bar, the more percentage of non-local money is being funding that use. So social services is predominantly funded with state and federal dollars, whereas the treasurer and the library are predominantly funded with local dollars. And the schools is kind of in the middle, and I've drew a line over, it's about 65% when it's all said and done, when we bring in the federal money and the state money, and we bring in the grant money, about 65% of all the expenditures for the schools is coming from local. So where does that local transfer come from? When we look at where our revenue in the general fund is sourced, 69.2% of all that revenue is coming from real estate and personal property taxes, a few other small categories. That's a very large proportion. The next slice here is from your meals tax, sales tax. So between general property and the sales tax. These are really the two that the Board of Supervisors has control over and can set the rates. That is a huge part of the revenue that is available to the board to invest in these different funds, state and federal, and then a small slice of general fund balance, which is basically the Board of Supervisors savings account. And those savings dollars are generally only invested in one-time needs like capital expenditures. So of that 8.4 million, this is where it has to come from. So it very quickly becomes a discussion of taxing people's property, taxing people's personal property, because those are really the only two avenues the General Assembly has allowed boards of supervisors to generate revenue. When in our case, there aren't a lot of businesses, we don't have big box stores from which we can collect other types of taxes. And we like it that way. So looking at the school fund in a little bit of detail, one of the things that came up during a joint meeting was a discussion of the cost of the transfer over time relative to declining enrollment, and the thought that was the community getting a good bang for the buck for their local contribution to the schools as enrollment declined. And I thought it was a very good question. So we looked into that a little bit, and I've prepared a chart. And the answer is our per capita spending has stayed about the same over the last 10 years or so when adjusted for inflation. And so if you take the CPI into consideration and the declining enrollment into consideration, the cost per pupil is about the same. You'll see that graphically on the next slide. The LCI, which was introduced by Dr. Grimsley, is complex yet simple. There's only 5 variables, really. And it's the true value of property, i.e. the property assessments. And that is the property assessment before any reductions are made for land use taxes that people may have heard of. It's the adjusted gross income for all the citizens in our county. It's not an average or a median, it's the total. So if you have somebody move into your community that has an income with many, many, many zeros, it can influence this number and this the LCI ultimately. And you can see that the value of the property and the adjusted gross income account together for 90% of the entirety of the LCI. And the balance is taxable retail sales, which quite frankly, we don't have very much of because we don't have big box stores or anything else. But the fact that it's only 10% of the input, it doesn't make a big difference. So those ratios, it's a ratio of our adjusted gross income and our property assessments to the entire adjusted gross income and entire assessments in the whole state. So that's how the LCI is developed. And as Dr. Grimsley noted, localities with a high LCI, those that are capped at 0.8, we're expected to be able to carry a higher cost share of the portion of K through 12 educational expenditures because we can afford it. At least that's what the formula is supposed to suggest. The fact that we have so much rural land and we've chosen locally to use land use taxation, which reduces the taxes on rural land that's farmed, it negatively influences this aspect because the LCI is calculated on the true value, but the tax generated and collected by the county is based on the land use value. Now, one could say, well, just get rid of land use and it'll fix that because you'll get a lot more tax revenue in. The problem with that is that land use protects our open spaces and protects these large parcels from being broken up into smaller parcels. It's very hard to be a large parcel holder if you have to pay taxes on it like it is valued that it could be a subdivision. And if in fact you're going to be taxed that way, you have to find some way to monetize and generate revenue so you can pay your taxes. It's also easy to see that a pasture full of cows or hay generally doesn't send children to school usually doesn't require a medic, and most of the time doesn't require law enforcement. So it doesn't generate much in the way of expenditures, and it's reasonable to think that that field should have a tax break. But that does lead to the problem of the state looks at our value of our property as that it's very, very high. But when we receive tax revenue, we don't receive tax revenue from that same perspective. So when I talked earlier about this stacked bar chart of our per pupil expenditures, then based on the type of revenue that we've received over those years. I know this can be a little confusing, but the bottom section of this stacked bar chart is local funds, local transfer. So for this year, we were talking about 8.6 million. All of it divided by ADM. So it's a per pupil cost each year. However, it's all based in 2011 dollars using a CPI to bring those dollars back. And when you do that, even though the enrollment and ADM number has dropped over time, inflation has gone in the opposite direction. So the per pupil cost in 2011 was just over $9,000. And the per pupil cost in 2021 was just over $9,000 when expressed in those 2011 dollars. So without really looking at both of those variables, it's hard to understand whether $9 million in 2011 equals $8.6 million today when you divide by ADM. But when you throw those numbers together, you can see that it is pretty consistent. The other thing that we can see is that Dr. Grimsley has been doing a very good job of growing this purple section over time. And that purple section is not state, not local, and it's grants. It's things like the PATH Foundation, Commit to be Fit. And so they're to be commended for finding those outside dollars, grow the entire bar without growing this blue section, the local section. That's very important. So getting back to LCI.
And Gary, we're running just a little bit low on time.
Okay.
So if we could have maybe like 2 more minutes and then
Yep.
take questions.
Absolutely. So I looked at the LCI today, and it is just a formula. So our local land values currently in our formula is at the red dot, around $2.1 billion. And if we use the land use value, it'd be closer to $1.6 billion. You can see as it would change over, if the value increased, you move towards the right. So right now our LCI is just under the max of 0.8. If we could get the General Assembly to reduce it to the land use, our LCI would be closer to 0.67. Interesting. The problem with that is the General Assembly has been very reluctant to do that because it's a zero-sum game. And if ours is to go down, somebody else is going to go up. Looking at one other variable in that same case, the ADM. So we says, well, if we just add more kids to the school, we'll be in good shape. Well, we can see we're the red dot. And as we add children to the school, your LCI would go down. And you can see if we could somehow find the extra kids to get to 1,200 kids, be back in the 0.6 range. Not sure where those kids come from, but they would certainly add extra cost in the schools as well. So use this as a takeaway, so sensitivity analysis to understand if the variables shift, what it may mean for our LCI and what it may mean for our revenue. And with that, I can finish and allow Brittany to take back over.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for just a couple of questions that we had in the chat. I know Steph Ritter had a question, so I'm going to ask her to unmute and ask her question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Got it? Okay, great. This follows on your conversation, Gary, about the LCI, which is the other result of having our property taxes that we have a really regressive property tax with those folks with lesser amount of property. paying a much greater amount of tax than those who own large parcels of property. And it seems to be both regressive and unfair. I know I myself have been part of, the call for conservation easements and other benefits, but is there some way of increasing the fair market value of the property, the larger pieces of property, so that we can have a less regressive tax system that's fair to people who can least afford to pay it, and also have more money for the schools?
Well, the Code of Virginia requires the assessment process to be run pretty strict standards and to recognize fair market value. With that said, with the land use program, and Mary Graham, our Commissioner of Revenue, is the expert here. Each of these parcels that includes a home site, that home site is separated off, and its value, that first acre for the home site, that's valued as a home site, whether it's a 1 acre parcel with a house or whether it's a 15 acre parcel with a house. That first acre is the home site. The remaining 14 acres, yeah, that is reduced in value, and it may give the appearance of inequity. I'm not sure how much inequity there is, because that first acre should be assessed very similarly, and the structures, of course, are assessed based on their quality. And that extra 14 acres, again, it doesn't send a lot of kids to school or require fire and rescue or law enforcement. But it's a very good question, and that perception is a very important consideration when these reassessments are done. But I can assure you that it's fair, and of course, we are going through a reassessment right now.
Thank you so much for your question, Steph. And I know we also had one more question from Ron
Thank
Goodman,
you.
and I am going to unmute Ron so he can ask his question to you, Mr. Curry.
Hi, Gary. I just had a very simple question, which was surrounding counties have three different ways of dividing up their taxable land. That is, there is an additional thing that I think we don't have, which is open space. And I was wondering if going to that kind of category, in other words, adding that space, would that be of any benefit in terms of possibly lowering the LCI? Thank you.
So that is another type of land use that can be allowed, open space. We don't use that here. It would not affect the LCI at all. The conservation easements can affect the LCI. The land use for farming or open space do not. And ultimately, if you added to, if there is additional property that isn't currently in land use and it was added to land use, you would reduce the overall tax revenue. Now, it may protect property, but it would reduce revenue.
But might it increase tax revenues?
Adding open space would not increase tax revenue.
Okay, thank you.
And we have one more question that I'll get to in this portion and then save the others for the next. But I know that Don Locke is on the call and had a question as well. So I am going to unmute Don and let him ask his question.
Yes, hello, Mr. Curry. I was wondering, how are ag forestal districts valued? Are they valued at the fair market value, such as land use land, or are they valued at use value, such as easement land in the LCI?
I'll have to tell you, I'm not exactly sure the answer to that. And it's one I would have to get back to the group after talking with the Commissioner of Revenue. But good question. And I can let you know. There are some limited restrictions on the property with ag and forestal, and I believe if the property leaves land use during any particular time, it could retain that tax break. But I'd have to dig back into that for you.
Yeah, it seems like from the state standpoint, since we don't have local control over whether or not the properties stay in ag forestal districts, being that even if we got rid of land use, they would still exist under separate statute, that perhaps they would allow us to value them at use value, such as easements, and that might affect our LCI, or might be a different way of maybe starting to lower that LCI.
And we have those in place for 10-year periods by ordinance, as opposed to land use that could come and go during a year, depending on its actual use that day. So that may be a different perspective to look at with the state.
Thank you so much, Don, for your question. And now we are going to move to our final presenter, Mr. Wesley Mills.
Hold on a second. I don't have a briefing slide. Can people hear me?
We can.
See me? Okay. I just wanted to share a few ideas this evening, and usually I make it a point to limit people to 3 minutes. So I'm going to try to live by that rule myself. I came onto the school board in 2000. I've been here and watched it transform over a period of the past 20 years. I've watched our requirements increase greatly. Little things that we see passed in legislation, No Child Left Behind, standards of learning, profile of a graduate, it goes on and on and on. The requirements continue to increase. The schools called on to adapt to these things and to meet these requirements by law. At the same time, in 2000, when I came on, the ADM was 1,025. And you saw tonight, it's currently around 780. It's a little more than 20% loss over 20 years. It's a number that's easy for us to remember, and we should be saying, how did that occur? What is the dynamic in our county that's causing that, and does it alarm us? It may not alarm us. Another thing I wanted to share was the idea that when Richmond decides something, that we in Rappahannock County, we pay the majority of the thing that they decided was a good idea. So for example, not that 5% raise for teachers is a bad idea, but they are only going to contribute about 16% of that great idea. The rest of it's going to come off of our local it's a local tax burden. And so the LCI and the SOQ, while these numbers are interesting, the bottom line, where the rubber meets the road, is we're going to be covering 84% of whatever they thought was a good idea in Richmond. And I wanted you to know too that over the last 2 decades, I've been a part of two groups. The first group tried to say the LCI is not fair. We went to Richmond and we said the LCI is not fair, and it needs to be parameters in there that adjust to preserve rural districts, because rural districts are getting hit in the gut. And my lesson there was the LCI is not going anywhere. They're afraid to touch it, because once they do, of course, you take money from somebody to give it to somebody else, and the large districts, the highly populated districts, don't want anything to do with touching that equation. We also formed a consortium. It was a group that was striving to create a new model to offer to Richmond, and that fell on its face as well. The LCI is not going anywhere. The only thing we can do is try to have an impact on it, and depending upon whether our county likes its culture the way it is, it may remain at 80%, at 0.8. The one thing that we do have control over is the ADM, possibly. For example, if you add 20 children to our school system, the amount of money that we'll be receiving from the state will go up, but it doesn't go up. When we add 20 children, we don't add a new class, for example. They're typically, sprinkled across the spectrum. So that's an interesting thing to think about. I wanted to tell you that we love our schools, and we hope that you do. We love the culture in our schools. It's small. It's very personal. And our goals for the board and our leadership here are very intentional and focused on outcome. And we strive to be responsible custodians of your money. An interesting thing to share with you before, and I'll say this in closing, this past year has been hard for everybody. But one thing that the COVID life has done to us is it's demonstrated the strength in our community to come together with the schools and to care for the children, for the sake of the children, to come together at a very difficult time for them in their life. And so it's been admirable what I've seen coming from our community into our schools over the past year. We have a great staff that's gone above and beyond, a great leadership team, which we have high confidence in. And I'd like to just conclude by saying I think we're at a great time in the life of Rappahannock County schools. That's what I wanted to share tonight. I don't have any numbers to share with you that are finite. So the best thing to do is to reserve the rest of the time for anybody that has a question, and which will more than likely be answered by Gary or Shannon.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mills. As an alum of our CPS, I'd have to agree. I think we are in a very good time in the school's history. We are going to open it up to a few more questions. I know that Eve Brooks had a question, so I am going to unmute her so she can ask.
Thank you. I was struck by the COVID money that's come in and is still coming into this year's budget, both at the county level and in the school district. And I'm wondering, hopefully we've done a great job, I think, of handling COVID. I can't say enough about the school district and what it has done. Nevertheless, we have a budget that is fairly well balanced this year, and I'm a little afraid of what might happen if we didn't have all this COVID money. I'd like to have a reaction to that.
Is Shannon here? She'd be best to speak to that.
Sure. I don't mind speaking to that at all. So we have been very creative and mindful of that very question, because the fear with any type of federal grant money is the eventuality that it's going to cease to exist, right? So with our planning with that CARES Act, and then ESSER 2, and then the CRF and GEARS and all these pieces of funding that have come our way, we've really been mindful of that very question. And what we did was work collaboratively with the county, with Mr. Curry, look at our capital improvement plan, and look at those one-time expenditures that have a heavy impact on the county, the school budget, the county budget as a whole. And also, the interesting thing about CARES Act dollars was there was no supplant provision. So as a federal programs coordinator, I get very excited about those instances because we're able to repurpose already allocated funds for COVID amelioration. So we're able to basically return back a greater deal of funding, which in turn helps everyone. As Mr. Curry said earlier, it's not the school and the county budget, it's all the same nut to crack, right? So we have to be mindful of that. The more we help each other that way, the better off we all will be.
Thank you, Dr. Grimsley. Any other comments? I don't know if Gary had anything to say about that. Curry?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Grimsley has it right. We've been very, very careful to use these one-time sources of revenue for one-time expenditures and not fall into the trap of allowing a windfall, if you will, to pay salaries so that we dig a very big hole for the subsequent year. The Board of Supervisors is anticipating another large revenue drop from the federal government from this latest stimulus, and they will be considering the various options for those dollars, and I will be strongly encouraging them to use it for one-time use, whether that be a broadband or some other eligible use.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank
Curry.
you. That's interesting.
And I know Betsy Deedle also had a question, so I'm going to unmute her. You can go ahead, Betsy. We are not hearing you, Betsy. I am not getting her audio, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask her question, which is for Dr. Grimsley. Betsy wants to know, how will the changing age and length of tenure of our teachers impact the school budget?
Certainly. So that speaks to the point that I made about our scale compression work. Many years ago, there was a vast salary scale study that was mindful of those approaching later years in the scale and becoming veteran teachers. So there was some longevity steps added in and more given towards steps later in the scale based on your population. Well, now those folks are nearing retirement. So what you're going to have is a gap in tenure, like you said, from many more starting year teachers or mid-year level teachers versus those at the end of the scale. Not as to say we wouldn't hire those at the end of the scale. We actually do that all the time, the best fit candidate. But we anticipate the need to, we anticipated that need and compress the scale accordingly to attract more new talent to the community. But that being said, of course, younger teachers, fewer years, lower on the scale, less in the budget. And that's how it impacts in that way.
Thanks, Dr. Grimsley. And I'm mindful of time. I know we're right at 8 o'clock, so I'd like to end on one question that I'd pose to you and Mr. Curry and Mr. Mills, if he would like to jump in too. What can we as Rappahannock County citizens and the public do to be more supportive of both of you as you're going through this budgeting process?
I'm unmuted right now, so I'll jump in and just say engaged. These are your tax dollars by and large. And when we talk about the school budget, a large portion of that are your tax dollars. So be engaged, understand the budget proposals from the school, from the county entire budget, understand what the program dollars are going towards, and ask good questions. The last thing I want to do is introduce a budget and have nobody ask any questions. We spend a lot of time and work preparing these documents, and we would love to have the citizens truly understand the complex nature of the document and the plan.
What he said. No, continue to be engaged, come to these meetings and submit comments. Just because you don't come to a meeting doesn't mean you cannot email, call anytime. And we have a philosophy, it's not just an open door policy, there's a no wrong door policy. Speak to whoever you're comfortable with and let us know how you feel and what's important to you. We care and we're here for you.
Thank you both so much. And I will, in the interest of time, toss it back to Mr. Gary Achel for some closing remarks.
I guess I'm unmuted now. First of all, I want to thank the presenters for their time and for their service to all of us, and for the way they've helped us lay the foundation for this series of conversations. Their charge was to help us try to understand the building blocks, their process, what they have to consider when they put these budgets together. And I think they did a great job tonight. So thank you to each of you for participating in this first of our series. I also want to thank all of you who participated. We had no idea how many people might show up. We had no idea whether any of you would have any questions or even be interested. And I think for the first night, we've demonstrated there is interest. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for your consideration of these issues. Before we sign off tonight, I think Brittany has put in the chat box the flyer that shows the full program for the remaining 2 sessions on March 31st and on April 14th, 2 Wednesday evenings at 7. I just want to highlight what's coming up next, coming attractions. We're very pleased to say that on Wednesday, March 31st at 7 p.m. Our opening presenters will be Michelle Fincham and Jenny Capsa, two dynamic, enthusiastic, great teachers, staff people from Rappahannock County Schools. Michelle will be talking about the Agriculture Academy, what it means, what it is, why it's important. And Jenny Capsa will be sharing with us some highlights from the new Profile of a Graduate curriculum. And in particular, she's going to look at how our responses to COVID and the community support produced a series of summer camps that grew into a wonderful Wednesday program. And there are other pieces to this, the Family Futures piece, the collaboration with Headwaters. So that will lay the foundation then for three panelists, Missy McCool, our own Headwaters Executive Director, Lenny Janot, and Tom Massey, who is the current chair of Family Futures Foundation here in the county. They will be responding to the presentations, and then we'll do the same thing we did tonight. We'll open it up and take some questions and have some comments. So put that on your calendar. If you can, I think there's a way to download the flyer. There'll be more stuff in the news, in the Rap News certainly, Mad Rap. But we wanted to wet your whistle and let you know that this is just the beginning of this conversation. And we think that in 2 weeks from now, we're going to come back and really learn some things and have a fascinating conversation. So on behalf of Headwaters, thank you for coming. Thank you for your time. Take care. Have a good evening. And I think we're done.